Hello and welcome. My name is John. This video is about artificial intelligence, or more specifically, AI's impact on photography and on the visual arts. As of late, I've seen a lot of articles and headlines about, art generators, AI art generators. I've played with them some myself. We'll get more into that a little bit later. And I've also watched some videos on the topic, read some articles, and I felt like I had something interesting to say on this topic, and so I took some time to gather my thoughts, and that's what this video is. Basically, what we're going to get into is we're going to talk about what this means for photography now, what I think it means for photography and art in the future, what I think will and won't get replaced by computers and AI art, what this new technology, like the impacts this new technology will have on basically what I do and what you do. There's a lot here and a lot to unpack, so that's kind of what we're going to get into as the video unfolds. I am perhaps moderately qualified to discuss this topic, as I am both a photographer as well as a software engineer. I don't work with AI or machine learning or anything like that. The stuff that I do is really boring, but I'm at least somewhat familiar with the space, and I'm certainly familiar with photography as a whole. So I'm not trying to come off as some kind of expert or anything like that, but I think you'll still find some of these thoughts useful. The first thing I want to discuss before we really get into any of the main topics is some of the legal controversy around this. The idea of feeding these AI art generators and computers effectively copyrighted works from, painters and photographers and other visual artists all around the world. I don't have much to say on this topic other than I agree with the concerns. I think it's a new problem, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in the future as new technology always brings kind of new ethical problems along with it. And I don't have much to say about it other than I acknowledge that it is controversial and that, I wouldn't want someone taking my photos and uploading them to an AI art generator without permission. I've done some of that on my own because they're my photos, but I don't really feel like just because a computer exists and can scrape photos off the internet, I'm not sure how I feel about then that system going and learning from the art that people have generated and spent their time doing. However, as we'll get into later, it is happening. So I just wanted to kind of get that out of the way up front without necessarily taking a firm stance in any particular direction. I don't really know how all this is going to pan out or what it means or what will and won't be legal into the future. It'll be interesting to see how all of that rolls out in the future. But I also didn't want to not acknowledge it either, as I think it is a problematic issue in this space. Finally, before we begin, what you're going to be watching during this video is a bunch of my photos that I've uploaded to an AI art generator. This one is called DALL-E or DALL-E or DALL-E. It's a soft double L. I don't know. That's the tool that I was using, and basically what I did is I took some of my photos, uploaded to that system, and then it spits out variations of those photos, and I thought I would kind of put those along with mine, and I thought it would be something interesting to watch while I talk about this topic. And obviously these are all my photos, so I don't feel like there's any sort of controversy in me doing what I want with them. Anyway, let's begin with some of the problems, because I think that's sort of an interesting way to frame this conversation. And I think to begin with, there's a lot of fear surrounding this topic right now. A lot of fear from people who make art, people who consume art, people who are photographers or painters or, illustrators. The fact that you can type, a 20 to 50 character prompt into a computer and then get a bunch of images out of it is, kind of scary if you're a person who has invested a large portion of your life learning the skills of composition and how to make interesting visual art, either with a camera or a brush or an iPad or whatever you use. And I am one of those people as well. I've spent a decade of my life taking photographs, trying to get better at taking photographs. And then a computer comes along and I can just write, tiger standing on a hill, and voila, there's a photograph of it. Here's the thing, at this point, the tools are fairly limited. If you actually go and kind of mess around with them, the resolution tends to be pretty low. I think the highest I've seen so far is like 1000 by 1000 pixels. And the results you get from these generators are all over the map at this point. Sometimes you get a thing that looks sort of like a photo. Sometimes you get some pretty bad artwork with, really weird stuff in there. And I've had a really difficult time generating sort of lifelike photography and images from these generators. And I keep seeing articles where there's amazing photographs come out of these things, and I have yet to figure out how to generate anything that looks really even decent. If you look at some of the details even a little bit, like they kind of give themselves away very quickly. And so I think even though this is a fear, and it is a real fear, I also think that the technology at this point is fairly limited. The question that we have now is, how long will it take for this stuff to really take off? And I think it will. I think the photos will get very good. They will become very lifelike. They will become high resolution, and it will change things. We'll talk more about that as we go through all my points here. But the timeline at this point is very uncertain. 4 or 5 years ago, we kind of thought virtual reality was going to take over. People would be working in virtual reality, and all of games would become virtual reality. And it's expanded, but it's definitely not a takeover. And at this point, I think it's hard to say if that will ever happen. And I think the same is true for these AI art generators, where the fear is in 3 years, no one will need to hire a model anymore because you can just use a computer. And I don't know that it will happen that quickly, if at all, really. So let's just acknowledge that we don't actually know how this will play out or the speed at which it will play out. With that said, I think at some point, computers and AI will be able to do a lot of different kinds of photography that actually don't require photographers to be in a location with a camera anymore. I think in the early stages, there'll probably be a lot of adoption in the stock photo space, and then also maybe in general, like art, fashion, stuff like that. Documentary will be a little bit slower, because I think that's a little bit trickier of a problem to solve with a computer, because the computer can't, travel to the war zone and take photographs. The computer can't, travel with you on your holiday and get shots of you on the beach. It's also a little bit tricky. Let's say you have some kind of product you want photographed. It might be a little bit difficult to, unless you already have a bunch of like 3D renders of it and stuff, to get a computer to spit out photos of it. But I think that is still also a space that eventually AI will make inroads in as well. And so it's definitely going to change the industry a lot. People are going to be able to get images more quickly and cheaper over time. And I think a lot of the fear at this point is that AI will start to take photography jobs. And I have some thoughts about that as well. At this point, none of this is written in stone. We don't actually know how it will pan out. But I think in the very early days, people who are looking to just have an interesting image hanging on their wall, for example, or someone who wants a stock photo of a castle, any castle, people who need photos for their websites that aren't of specific people or specific places. They just kind of need general visual content. I think that will be one of the first early uses of this, and that will probably happen pretty soon. We're probably not too many years away from that at this point. And so a lot of, if you're making money in those kinds of industries as a photographer, I could definitely see that changing in the near future. What is a little bit more difficult, as I've spoken to a little bit already, is any kind of documentary photography. So we have a lot of the components already for a computer to document an event with photographs. So, for example, we have 360 cams now, and you can take a 360 cam, and you don't have to create a composition. You just hold the camera, and it's recording video all the time in every direction. Now, these videos tend to be lower resolution. It's not generating like photos really, unless you go and pick out a frame or go into photo mode or whatever. So there's a lot of still user input with these tools. But in the future, I do think that someone will be able to take a camera like a 360 camera. It will be much higher resolution, and artificial intelligent, programs and software will be able to look at that footage and generate new photographs that don't exist. So you'll be able to hold the 360 cam in your hand, let's say over your head, and the computer, when you get home to your desktop or whatever, will actually be able to generate a photo as if someone was standing in front of you with a 50 millimeter lens taking a photo of you in that environment. It won't be real in the sense that no one was really there. The composition and the angle and all the elements and the light will be fake, but it will be almost real because you were actually there with this other tool that was being used at the time. I hope that makes sense. So I think we will get to this point where there's this really interesting blend of actual photography and computational photography and sort of a mix of footage, real footage, and computer AI derived footage or photos. And so we're approaching a world, as you're already seeing with smartphones now, Google's doing a lot with computational photography, where those systems begin to blend. And the idea of just using a camera to take a photo is now in some ways a little bit antiquated, and I think it will continue to be thus in the future. Now, I think we're probably pretty far away from anything like that, anything like you being able to just, stick a camera on a selfie stick and then never take any photos again. I think that's pretty far out at this point, if it happens at all. But some of the tools are kind of there, and I could see things unfolding in that regard. Here's the thing, though, and in terms of photography and jobs and getting paid for those of you who do that. Let's say I was getting married. If that was happening, I wouldn't want to be relying on computational images, generated images to document that event, even if that was possible, and it's not really now. I want someone to take actual photographs of my wedding, and I think most people would feel that way, especially any kind of important event. Also in journalism, if you were going to send someone to go get images as from a war zone or from some sort of big gathering, you're not going to want a computer to do that. You're going to want a human to do it because you're going to want the photos to be actually real and verified as real. And I think that also will become something that happens in the future. Is we will have to say where photos came from. CNN will publish a photo and have to say, this is, an actual photograph, not non-generated photograph. I could see that happening on a lot of stuff in the future. And so I don't think the idea of the whole photography industry disappearing is a legitimate one. I don't think the idea that people would just stop taking photographs is true, but the landscape is definitely going to change over time. I was watching one of my favorite YouTube photography channels by James Popsy. I'll link that in the description. He's one of my favorites. And he was talking a little bit about how a new camera had come out. I think it was the latest Sony full frame camera, and how amazing the autofocus was. And he was saying that he felt as though maybe it was too good. Maybe the camera had gone too far in that it won't be fun for him to use the camera because it is too good at focusing, and there's no challenge to be presented anymore. And so when you think about artificial intelligence and these photo generators and the idea that they're going to sort of steal this craft from you or take it from you, I think is sort of the wrong way to frame the question or the problem, because as technology advances and gets better, it sort of does lower the bar to, for example, taking good photos. As the cameras improve, like digital, for example, when digital came out, suddenly you could take, tens of thousands of frames instead of just a handful of rolls of film somewhere. And so the speed at which you were able to improve your abilities was, exponentially increased. And that will be true of AI as well. And on some level, I don't know how this will work. Maybe it will help people edit their photos or help people compose them or take them. Like, that whole space is not clear to me at this point. But at some point, it becomes less fun. And I think that is where you actually need not worry, because people are still shooting film cameras now for whatever reason, right? It doesn't really make sense from an empirical standpoint. If the whole goal of photography was just to get a technically perfect image as quickly as possible without any problems, no one would go back and shoot film because film is inferior in like every regard if those are the metrics. But here's the thing. Film is fun to shoot. Film looks interesting. it's challenging to shoot. The analog feel of film and the process of using it and developing it and then getting the image back is enjoyable and immersive. And so people have gone back to it because they're wanting more of that in their lives. And so, AI is a step in the opposite direction. And so the idea that it will eliminate all photography, I think is really not valid, because, photography didn't eliminate all painting. I do some painting on my own. I'm not particularly gifted or anything. I do it mostly because it's relaxing, and I like that I can just make whatever I want instead of having to deal with the limitations of a photo where I need to actually photograph a thing that exists in reality. And there's no reason for me to paint anything. I don't need to paint anything. There are much better painters in the world, and I have a camera that I know how to use, so I could just take photographs of things. I just mostly do it because I enjoy it, and I think that will be true in the future for photography as well. People will carry on with cameras and using them because they like to. And at some point, using a digital camera, that isn't assisted by computers in any way, will be traditional. That will be old school at some point. I think also that some of the fear surrounding this topic maybe can be mitigated by the fact that there will be really cool parts of this too. I can imagine a situation where I, for example, were to import, say, 1,000 photographs from a trip that I took somewhere, and then AI could go through and give me a bunch of interesting double exposures from all of those digital images that I wouldn't really have had time to generate myself. And, I don't really do a lot of that anyway, but it's like an interesting creative angle that will be offered to me basically instantly that I wouldn't have had before. And I think that's kind of neat. And there will probably be a lot of stuff like that in the future that will help people make new creations that we had never really even thought of before. So in summary, before we move on to the next section, I think in the short term, none of this really threatens photography jobs or photographers, honestly, really at all. In the future, I think there will be impacts and changes, but it's hard to say how extensive that will be. And certainly, if you take photos because you enjoy it, no one will ever be able to strip that from you. I guess if you wanted to sort of future-proof your job security and your photography, anything that is involved in documenting, if you're a portrait photographer of people who are getting ready for an event, like, a couple getting ready to get married, or a group of people who just came back from some kind of excursion, if you're going on adventures with people, if you're documenting weddings or doing anything of that sort, which is honestly a huge part of like how people get paid for photos. I don't know. I don't see much worry there. It'll be interesting to see if some of the fashion stuff gets replaced, if computers can like take this dress that it has photos of and then create an imaginary person and put it on them and then generate a bunch of photos of them in different environments. I think that probably will happen fairly early on in this whole thing. How much it gets used, I don't know. Also, there's all kinds of controversy around that too, right? Like, what is beauty, and like what kind of people are these images generating, and what do they look like? And are we setting, beauty standards maybe already are somewhat unrealistic, and how much worse does that get when the people aren't even real? So there's all kinds of controversy and interesting stuff that I'm sure will go on with that as well, assuming this even goes in that direction, but I think it certainly could. So I think, ultimately there probably will be fewer photography jobs in the future. How many fewer and of what kind and variety? Well, I think at this point it's hard to say. We just need to keep watching things as they change and just be observant. And that kind of carries us into the next section here. What can you do then as a photographer or as a visual creator if this new system, this new technology, thousands of computers across the world who don't need to input their time or energy into making images, they can just spit them out pretty much instantly? Where does that leave us in terms of art, in terms of photos, in terms of creating? First of all, I think some of the fear surrounding this is because people feel like once computers can make really great images, then the only images that anyone will want to look at or view or consume will be images created by computers. And that I think is actually a false narrative. Here's the thing. If that was true, then there would be a perfect, for example, a perfect photo. Like there would be one photo in the world that was so good, was so perfect, was so just objectively pristine that everyone likes to look at this photo and they don't care about any other photos. But of course, you and I know that that isn't true, right? Just because one photo is good doesn't mean I'm no longer interested in other photos. Same is true for film. There isn't a film that is the best film that everyone likes. It is the pinnacle of art. And now there's no need to have other films or one director who makes films. Like you could say, oh, well, this director makes the best films, and so now we'll just watch the films from this director. That's not how art works, and that's not how human consumption of art works. In fact, it's really interesting to see that even though Hollywood exists with all like this, glamour and fame and all of these tools and fancy tools that can, like, they can create these awesome movies. And even though there are hundreds of great documentary filmmakers who make really cool documentaries, and there's, public broadcasting, which has some good series. And then there's all these private companies who make TV shows and series. And yet, even though all that exists, people still want to get on YouTube and watch cat videos. So go figure. Like there's entire YouTube channels dedicated to people just eating food, for example. There's like every kind of permutation of interest that could possibly exist. That need is being met somewhere. And so the idea that AI will kind of, I think, monopolize all of visual art or all of photography, I think that probably is not true. There will still be space for you because what you do is unique and interesting, and it is something that really only you can do. And a computer will be able to copy you, I suppose, but that doesn't mean that no one will be interested in you anymore. I think one of the cool things about AI art is that it probably will help enhance your creativity a fair amount as well. It will somehow open new doors to people who otherwise couldn't make visual art before. It will allow them to do things that they were not capable of doing before. And I think overall that will be a really interesting sort of experience, and it will be a unique time to live in. The same as when photography happened. When cameras came out and people started using them, I'm sure there was the feeling that, well, what, anyone can just make images now? You don't have to pick up a brush and figure out how light works and how to represent people. You can just use a camera. It's fake. It's not, it's not real. It's not artistic. It's not legitimate. And of course, we all know the explosion of photography that happened and how many more artists now exist in the world because of that. And so even though there is some sort of fear around this topic and some trepidation, and I think rightly so, certainly some controversy as we've gotten into a little bit as well, I think ultimately it will be really interesting too, and maybe even a good thing on some level. Hard to say at this point. It's weird to think that I'm investing all this time in making this YouTube channel and creating visual art when maybe in 5 years a computer will be able to make a way more interesting YouTube channel. And I don't know, like maybe this is like the dumbest time in history to be doing what I'm doing. It's hard to say, but here's the thing about that I'll sort of leave you with. Photography and art is mostly for you, and I think most of us are drawn to it because it has transformative power and healing power and the power to engage us and keep us interested, the power to explore an environment or people or a place or a thing in a way that we couldn't do before without a camera. And a computer can't take that away from you. And that is like a part of my life that I need to be healthy and to be engaged. And so just because a computer can generate compelling images doesn't mean that I no longer want to use a camera anymore or make art, because it does all of these things sort of internally and intrinsically for me. And I'm not going to get the same experience out of just typing a short paragraph into a computer terminal and getting an image back. And so I think you can always approach life in two ways, in my opinion. One is with an attitude of fear. How do I defend what I have? And the other is an attitude of embracing what is happening. And that doesn't mean you like what is happening. Sometimes really bad stuff happens. But resisting it, pretending it doesn't exist or isn't happening, being afraid of it or pushing it away, especially when it's something that is already occurring, in my experience, is not a very effective way to live. And I think that's true of, this situation as well. There are lots of problems with this new technology, and I am sort of afraid of it in a way, but also it's happening. This is not going to stop, even if it gets regulated and how images are consumed has changed, like all of that stuff, however that shakes out, this is still going to go on and progress, and things are going to change, and it is going to affect all visual arts and photography specifically. And so adopting a stance of embracing the fact that that is true, and then figuring out what to do and how to move forward and how I can use the tools is probably a better approach than just burying your head in the sand or being mad about it. So that's sort of my feeling at this point. We'll see what happens in the future. I think those are kind of all my thoughts about this. I hope you enjoyed this little episode, and we'll get back to sort of our regular content with some point of view photography and stuff soon. I've got a trip to Japan coming up next year, early next year. So planning to make a ton of videos about that. Things are kind of winding down here. It's November now. So got a couple more things I think to release, and then that'll sort of close out the year, and hopefully we'll start the new one with something interesting and exciting. Thank you so much for being here. If you're a subscriber, or even if you just are new here and made it to the end of this, I really appreciate you. If you have a second, leave a comment. Let me know what your thoughts are. Ask some questions or say something interesting or not very interesting, whatever suits you. Take care. We'll see you in the next one.